Welcome, everyone. I'm excited to be here to discuss the opportunities and challenges surrounding transportation electrification today. As a brief refresher, in 2021, President Biden signed into law the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which is going to bring $78 million to build a fast charging network to Wisconsin, as well as additional federal funding opportunities. The national plan to decarbonize our transit sector will be accelerated even further by the Inflation Reduction Act passed this past August. Since it was signed into law, it's estimated that over $40 billion in clean investments have already been made in this country. So of all these opportunities, there are also realities on the ground that each of our panelists is going to cover and address how we can serve and create a roadmap for those of us in the room today, whether we are part of the charging industry, a utility, a municipal government, or a fleet operator, and how we can maximize these investments for Wisconsin. So let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Jena Ginsburg. I'm the Midwest Policy Manager for ChargePoint. About ChargePoint, we are about a 15-year-old company based in California. We have about 460 stations in the Wisconsin area, or rather in the state. And something unique about ChargePoint is we don't own and operate our stations. We primarily serve as the conduit, no pun intended, to those looking to invest in charging solutions. And since our founding in 2007, this is some of the global impact we've had. 160 million gallons of gasoline consumption avoided, and about 700,000 metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions have been offset. So without further ado, I will introduce our panelists and then hand it off to my friends at DOT. So I will go down the line. First, we have Deborah Erwin, Director of Policy and Program Planning at Xcel Energy, Mark Vander, attorney at Godfrey and Kahn, Kaleb Vander, Transportation Electrification Project Manager at the Wisconsin Department of Transportation, and Brian Elliott, Program and Policy Analyst at the Wisconsin Department of Transportation. So I'm going to kick it off to Kaleb and Brian to get us started today.
Thank you so much, Jena. And today we've got two parts to our presentation. First of all, I'm going to do just a quick 2-minute walkthrough of the WEVI program, what we hope to accomplish and where. And then Brian is going to give us a quick update on where we are with the program and what some of our next steps look like. Next slide, please. So as Jena had mentioned, we have received $78.65 million from the bipartisan infrastructure law. Those dollars will specifically support the construction of fast chargers in the state of Wisconsin. In that program, we are required to install chargers every 50 miles along what we call our alternative fuel corridor system in the state. And the one thing I'm going to touch on next is that system and why that system is important. At each location, we have to install a minimum of 4 charging ports at 150 kilowatts simultaneously. Jena, next slide, please. So what's really important for the department as we prepare for this program is the system that we're going to be building out. One of the approaches that Wisconsin took that was different from other states was in a designation of really a very robust system of alternative fuel corridors. Up to 2022, we had designated about 1,200 miles. And in preparation for the NEVI program, we designated an additional 781 miles last year, with those miles primarily being in the northern third of the state. So as a result, we are looking at approximately 61 project locations that we'll be supporting through this program. And because of the significant system of routes that we've designated, those charging stations will be deployed with fairly significant geographic diversity across the state. And with that, I can pass it to Brian.
All right, thanks, Kaleb. As far as the Wisconsin Department of Transportation's timeline, that is dependent very much on the final rules that are to be issued by the federal government relative to the NEVI program. And there are also some challenges, as we'll discuss today, associated with our state statutes in order to be compliant with those federal rules. WisDOT still has many details at this point in time to work out regarding program implementation and administration prior to officially announcing the availability of funds. In the coming months, WisDOT anticipates developing options and to implement and the approved NEVI plan by evaluating the most effective methods to achieve the goals of the program.
All right, thank you so much. I'm going to pass it on to Deb.
Great, thank you. Deborah Erwin with Xcel Energy, and I lead our clean transportation team working on policy and regulatory matters across all of Xcel Energy's 8 states across the country, including in Wisconsin. So just wanted to talk a little bit about how we view the utility role to support transportation electrification before we get into kind of the Q&A today. So you may be aware that Xcel Energy has ambitious carbon reduction goals for its electric utility business as well as its natural gas utility business. We also have goals related to transportation electrification, and that's what you see on this slide here. So we have goals for ourselves in terms of where we would like to be by 2030 and by 2050. And that's by 2030, we would like to be supporting 1 out of every 5 vehicles in our service territory area being electric. And by 2050, that we would be supplying the fuel for all vehicles being a zero carbon emission vehicle by 2050. So that is not a small task, but we have a few points that go along with that. Obviously, there's huge carbon savings associated with that. There's also a lot of cost savings that comes along with that as well for drivers as they switch from internal combustion engines to electric transportation. We want to make sure that as we're doing this, and we'll talk a lot more about this today, our customers have easy access to EV charging. So, what we don't have today is widespread access to charging for electric vehicles. And so that's a huge part of what we're focused on is getting convenient, affordable, easy access for all of our customers to make sure that we're supporting both EV adoption and the benefits of transportation electrification for all of our customers, not just early adopters. No, that's okay. We also have a goal for our own fleet to be electric as well, I think is the last point there. So specifically on the topic of public fast charging, we have proposed some plans in a few of our states and have authority in a few of our states as well to own and operate public fast charging stations. So what you see here are a few details relating to a proposal pending at the Public Service Commission, and you can share the docket information afterwards if you're interested. But, the bottom line is we started by assessing the need for public charging in our service territory specifically, and in doing that have identified that there's a pretty big gap in public charging. And so, our approach is to try to directly address that gap, and that can be done in a complementary way to the federal funds that I think is a big focus of the discussion today. And so I think we'll get into that in the Q&A. But let's see. Yeah, I think the overall approach is to try to make sure that, from our perspective as a public utility, we want our customers to have really a foundational public charging network that can support their needs everywhere they go in our service territory. You can go to the next slide. So some more details, and these are all in our filing with the Public Service Commission. But, we can't do this alone. This actually requires effort from a lot of folks. And so we'll, need to rely on a number of different vendors, charging providers, software providers to support this type of an effort. And, hugely important are site hosts who would be interested and willing in hosting public charging stations. And then, practically, we would do this by leasing or having an easement on those site hosts' land. And then, we can talk about the details a little bit more. Kaleb talked about there's some specific requirements for stations that comply with the NEVI program. And, we've sort of sketched out a few different station types in terms of, different types of needs that could be met by public fast charging, right? So it's not all the same sort of thing. Some needs are more related to, arriving at a destination. Others are more sort of an on-the-go need. And so we want to be not using a one-size-fits-all approach, but making sure that we're tailoring the needs to what is needed from drivers in our service territory. So I think that's it for now. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Mark, I'll pass it to you.
Thanks. Hi, my name is Mark Vander. I am an attorney at Godfrey and Kahn, but before that, I had the privilege of working at the PSC. So I'm going to kind of go over what this agency is and why it's important as far as EV regulation. In addition to the Department of Transportation, the Public Service Commission will have a big role in EV adoption going forward as well. So what is it? The Public Service Commission is an independent agency made up of 3 commissioners who are appointed by the governor for staggered 6-year terms. So every 2 years, a commissioner is up for reappointment. And there's a chairperson who's also appointed for 2 years at the agency. It also has about 130 plus staff, including analysts, engineers, financial auditors, accountants, lawyers. They run the gamut on expertise at the PSC. To give you a kind of an idea of their importance in the state, they regulate over 1,000 public utilities that provide electric, gas, water, and sewer service in the state. And in the latest strategic energy assessment, they noted that over 5 IOUs serve nearly 90% of the state's electric customers and manage a peak demand of over 14,000 megawatts, to kind of give you an idea of the scope of what they're regulating. Next slide. So PSC and EVs. So about 3 years ago, 2019, the Public Service Commission opened an investigative docket into EV policy and regulation with the goal of investigating present and future policies of EV infrastructure related to electric service. Largely revolved around a number of things. The electric rates applicable to EV charging, which I think you can all agree would be a big piece of how EV adoption goes in the future. The load management of the increased electric use associated with EV deployment, and the role of the regulated utilities in EV deployment. Now, all 5 OUs have pilots or programs that either happened before this docket or came out of this docket, and they largely revolve around residential pilot programs and commercial fleet programs for the utilities to start gathering data and look at use cases and how they might structure their rates and rate design going forward. Next slide. So the big issue right now, as folks in the Department of Transportation noted, was in the NEVI program, the notice of proposed rulemaking, kind of how the program is going to be governed. In that notice, they said that chargers will be required to display and base the price of electric charge in dollars per kilowatt hour. And sought specific comments on whether dollars per minute or dollars per mile or some other display should be considered. In Wisconsin, under Chapter 196, the direct sale of electricity to customers can only be from public utilities. And I won't cite that entire statute, but the important parts here are to own, operate, manage, or control any part of a plant or equipment within the state for the transmission, delivery, or furnishing of power either directly or indirectly to or for the public. So the big question is, how are these chargers going to supply electricity? How are we going to figure out who and where we can charge dollars per kilowatt hour, or how the charging infrastructure is going to pay for itself? On the legislative and policy front, the legislature has looked at fixing this or providing some kind of clarity in this area. Last session, there was a bill that went back and forth, had a number of amendments, ultimately didn't pass. But everybody's going to be looking, I think, this session to see some kind of legislative or statutory fix to provide clarity for all the deployment that we're going to need over the next couple of years. So I think that's it.
Thank you all. So with that, I'm going to start with some questions. I think we've established that NEVI is a really large undertaking here, and I think all our panelists and those in the room know it's a bit more complicated than moving these federal funds and just energizing a site, right, Deb? So, I think it'd be helpful if you can all share from your organization's perspective, what are the primary challenges to building out a NEVI site today in Wisconsin? And what can those of us here in the room today keep in mind as Wisconsin DOT and stakeholders develop not only the NEVI program, but all future transportation electrification programs? And whoever wants to start.
Thank you for the question, Jenna. I'll dive right on in. From the department's perspective, as we've started to think about this program really throughout the last year, the main need has been really the technical development of the program. And as I look around this room, there's a lot of individuals who have helped us understand what this EV space looks like for us as a department and how we're going to best be able to deliver these projects. And as my colleague Brian here was describing, we still have a major technical lift in preparing for the program. With those final rules for the program that we hope to receive really soon, we'll be able to again re-engage with stakeholders as we kind of finalize our overall vision for the program.
Great.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think I would add, so that is probably step one or one of the early steps. There's a lot of additional steps, just in thinking about actually building out these stations, right? There can be pretty long lead times to get stations constructed. So some of that has to do with supply chain, and some of that has to do with distribution systems. So, the ability of the utility distribution system to accommodate and interconnect any of the NEVI sites is site-specific, right? What does the distribution system capacity look like at that specific location? So if it needs an upgrade, that will take longer, right? That's design time, that's equipment lead time. And so I think that's something for everybody to be aware of. And to that end, I would encourage you all to contact your utility early, whether it's for a NEVI site or anything else. So if you have big plans to add EV charging load, you need to talk to your utility, your co-op, your municipal utility, whoever it is, because there may be some real planning needed to accommodate the project that you want to do. So the earlier you can talk to the utility, the better, for sure. And then the one other thing I would say, I think everybody is focused on getting these sites built, and this maybe gets to the technical standards point that Kaleb made, once they're built, we want them to work well, right? We want them to be operational, and some of those standards are going to have to do with requirements for keeping the chargers operational and available for charging, and I can't sort of stress that enough. This isn't just about literally building chargers. It's about building a well-functioning network that will support travel and the transportation needs of the public.
Mark, did you want to add something?
Yeah, and I think from my point of view, it's that clarity around what is a public utility and who can charge at the charging stations. I think on the public side, from my previous life, knowing having clarity from the commission, they I don't think want to regulate every single charger because there's going to be hundreds of thousands of them as a separate utility. And on the private side, I know I've talked to clients and potential clients who are looking at developing Wisconsin, say, we just don't know. We're not going to come. We're deciding not going to bother. There's other states that we can focus on and do our business in that we have more clarity in. So I think that having some kind of definitive answer and clarity on that is going to be really important going forward.
Yeah. You know what, Mark, you got into my next question. Exactly, I guess the elephant in the room in Wisconsin is, this pricing issue is Wisconsin's prohibition against the resale of electricity and that clarity that 43 states in the country have established. So, Mark, you just touched on it, but if anyone else wants to add, why does this create a hurdle for the development of the EV charging market, not only for the NEVI program and what we all assume are the requirements once we have a confirmation, but how does this affect the program and any future development in the state and investments?
Absolutely. So as we've kind of understood, the NEVI program rules as they've evolved is requiring this as, that method of sale. But from a more base level perspective from the department's not interested in owning or operating charging stations. We've really viewed these NEVI dollars as being a catalyst for industry in the state, really to help a lot of our business partners be able to get to their return on investment from their initial EV projects. We view, a more definitive method of sale, that kilowatt by hour, as being that opportunity for the business community to be able to get to that method, to get to that return on investment. And again, with that fix, we think and we hope that it'll make Wisconsin a little bit more competitive from that business perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just add, this is an all hands on deck sort of need. We need everybody to be able to come to the table and, bring charging stations to serve the needs of the public. So, what I think is needed is hopefully a very simple and straightforward legislative fix. I think what happened last session was, as Mark said, a lot of other amendments got made to the bill, and it got bogged down by a lot of other issues. So, I think if it can be simple and straightforward, I think it'll have a much better chance this year.
Yeah, and I'll just add, from the charging industry's perspective, the pricing question, it becomes complicated because I think, Kaleb, you alluded to this, there's this perhaps lack of efficiency in pricing at charging stations. If you're pricing by the mile or by time, not every vehicle is going to electrify, or rather receive the charge at the same rate. And that's really the concern we have, is we want charging to be equitable in terms of pricing across scale. And this time function, that's the equivalent to going to the gas pump today and saying you pump for 5 minutes and that's what you get. And I don't think we all agree that doesn't quite work so well. So we want every station operator, whomever it is, to be on an even playing field. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit. Something that's really important, not only under IIJA, but under all transportation electrification programs in the future in the state, is to make sure that low-income communities and rural communities are integrated into these plans in the future. As we all know, low-income communities often burden a disproportionate share of carbon emissions, and rural communities are often left off the literal map. So I think it's important that we discuss how are they being brought into the federal plans and state plans, kind of like Deb alluded, Xcel's vision for the future. So how can we make sure they're adequately represented, and what are your organizations or businesses doing to really ensure they have the tools to participate in the future EV ecosystem? So
Thank you.
Yeah.
From WisDOT's perspective, this is something that we took very seriously in the development of our WEVI plan last year. During that plan development process, we met with 58 groups and organizations prior to submitting our plan, and we did that only in a couple of months. Since that plan submittal in August, we've continued those outreach and engagement efforts. And as we, again, NEVI is our first program, EV program deployed by WisDOT. We're going to continue to look for those opportunities to partner with both urban and rural communities as we begin this program and as we start looking forward to other programs that are going to emerge fairly soon here.
Deb, do you want?
Yeah, I think, I kind of alluded to it earlier, and you saw the map of kind of potential charging needs in Xcel Energy's territory. We took a very data-driven approach to identifying charging needs, and, looking at that, I think it's just essential to not just serve where EV adoption is today, but where EV adoption will be, 5 years, 10 years from now, right? And part of what we're thinking about is not just sort of letting that happen, however it's going to happen, but seeing the role of access to public charging being a driver of EV adoption, right? So currently access to EV charging or lack thereof is a barrier to EV adoption. So if we don't address that barrier, there will continue to be inequitable EV adoption. And so I think that sort of the concept, which is clearly inherent in the NEVI program, in the WIVI plan from the state, is, and also in Xcel Energy's plans as well, is just, what is needed from like a foundational perspective to make sure that everybody has access to public charging.
I think from Public Service Commission point of view, I think they did a really good job in both in that initial investigative docket and then in other dockets too, kind of asking questions, asking utilities, what are you doing for multifamily housing? How can those folks take advantage of EV adoption as well? And I think, to the utilities' credit, many of them are also, already looking at it or are now looking at it and proposing pilots to see, what's the best way to get this to work to make sure everybody's included in this transition.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you all. So one last question, and then hopefully open it up to the audience. So under IIJA, states were also asked to investigate rates that would promote greater transportation electrification. Traditional demand charges on electricity don't necessarily reflect the characteristics of EV charging today. DC charging site hosts, so like those who would be operating a NEVI site, are going to continue to face the challenge of balancing these high power loads while utilization is going to remain low in the near term. So I think it'd be great if you could elaborate maybe just on demand charges, how you think they're going to impact the industry's development, and perhaps what's a fair solution to balance these EV adoption demands and these investments that we expect to see in the state. So Deb's smiling, so I'm going to...
Go ahead.
No. Okay, so I have this excellent white paper that you should all read if you really want to know more, by the Alliance for Transportation Electrification. I'll try to hit the highlights. So for anyone, I think people in general have talked about the challenge with demand charges for EV charging, but maybe to sort of take a step back of like, what is a demand charge? So utilities charge rates, right, for the electricity that they sell. One of the things that those rates are intended to recover is like how much a specific site or customer is contributing to a utility's peak. So, the time of day that you use energy makes a difference in terms of how much it costs to serve that need, for example. So when we think about especially public fast charging, what you're trying to do is deliver a lot of energy in a very short amount of time. And so that requires a decent amount of infrastructure and capacity to deliver that energy all at once. How utility rates work in general is we try to, and all of our rates are subject to review and approval by the Public Service Commission, but we try to base them on the costs to provide that energy. So the reason I'm talking about this is because when a public fast charging station is used infrequently, it may be used, may deliver a lot of energy in a short amount of time, but then not be used for a lot of time there, right? So it's very peaky is how that works. So we need the infrastructure and we need the capacity to deliver all of that energy when there's a bunch of cars there wanting to all charge at the same time, but then it might sit idle for a long time. And so the question is, what is the appropriate way to charge for that situation? And so the industry overall and folks trying to build EV public charging stations, I think, see this as a challenge when utilization of public charging is low. And it is a challenge because it can feel cost prohibitive when what you're trying to do is, simply put in the infrastructure and then recover the costs associated with that, right? It's really difficult to pass those costs onto a very small number of drivers using that station. However, if we try to get rid of those charges, that we don't get rid of the costs incurred to serve that. So that's sort of where the rubber meets the road. And so a very long-winded way of addressing this point. I'll get off my soapbox here, but we need to find a way to still recover the costs for serving that load, but maybe not make it feel like a huge burden for the provider of public charging. And so there are different ways that you can look at transitional, like short-term relief for demand charges. You can look at different ways to recover costs that maybe would embed the costs associated with that typical demand charge into the per kilowatt hour rate. There's actually a variety of different solutions that can be brought to the table, but it's a pretty complicated issue, and it's not one that, as a utility, I'm not interested in it being cost prohibitive to have public charging available to people, right? But what we do need is to be able to recover the costs of serving that load. And so we just need really a fair and equitable approach that also recognizes the public policy goals associated with supporting this transition. And so, it requires a little bit more creativity in rate design.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I'll just say from the charging industry's perspective, we definitely understand that cost recovery piece and the balancing the needs. I think to give the perspective on a site host, the O&M costs, the operation and maintenance costs, which include electricity costs and demand costs, demand charge costs, those can be the largest line item on their monthly bill, let's say. So this is a significant burden to making that investment, especially if it's a site that maybe has only high demand on the weekends and the rest of the week it kind of sits idle. So it's something we're all working together, and there are rate design options that exist in the country. Happy to I don't have a paper to show you, but I'm happy to walk through other rates and ideas that some territories are starting to explore now as we see more and more pull. But I'll pass it back to my other panelists if they want to add anything on demand charges. You can also pass if you do not want to. Okay, great. No one wants to say anything else on demand charges. Yeah, I can open it up to questions. Before you ask your question, if you could just say your name and hopefully project as much as possible. Someone has a mic. Never mind.
Hi, my name is Bill Bailey with Check Bay Renewables, and this is right to Deb's comment. Xcel already has in place the 100 rule. Maybe you could talk about that and how that could solve the problem in the near term, and then when the usage gets increased, then they can pay their demand charges, and you can recover your fees, but just down the road a bit.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. So one of the rate design options we do have in Xcel Energy's Wisconsin service territory on our tariff books today is a 100 hours demand limiter. So what that means is, when you hit that peak less than 100 hours, it kind of doesn't count, right? So like the way that the rates have been designed is cost-based, and it is intended to recover the costs associated with, providing the service. But the charge is not imposed on like your peak demand if you don't reach that peak more than 100 hours. So that actually has worked fairly well, or that type of rate design works pretty well when you have very low utilization. And so then, as you said, right, as station utilization increases, as stations are just used more, this actually becomes potentially a non-issue, at least for a number of public charging stations. This is an issue for the period of time in which a station is pretty low utilization. I'll say there may be stations that will remain at, single-digit utilization for the foreseeable future, 10 years, 20 years out into the future, right? Because you can imagine not every area is a very high traffic area, right? So hopefully overall, as a whole, something like that, that's not a rate design that we did just for EVs. That's something we've had on the books for actually a really long time, and it meets a lot of customers' needs.
Thank you.
My name is Nick Hine. I have an electric car, and from having driven it around Wisconsin last year, I get a sense that we are deficient in the number of charging stations now. Do you have a way of measuring that or an idea of how many we're deficient by? And
we don't necessarily have that type of a metric, but we do generally, your anecdote is what we hear from users of the system almost every day when we have these conversations, that when you start to get outside of some of our major metro areas, your opportunities for public available charging are very sparse. So what you'll see in our plan is, as we talk about, all of the alternative fuel corridors that we have, by having the amount of routes that we have, we'll be able to put charging stations in places under this program, whereas other states will be very connected to their interstates. We also have U.S. highways and state highways as well that we'll be able to support.
thank you.
I'll also just add, part of not only NEVI, but all the other transportation focused funds under IIJA is exactly to address the problem we just said, is you're already an adopter, but how do we encourage more EV adopters? It's a chicken or egg, but if you build, they will come, and we need to build. And that's, NEVI is one piece of it, is this fast charging network across not only Wisconsin, but to connect to other states and, in theory, get you across the country, but it's also the local charging network. So what you're doing, I think the efforts are there, but hopefully with interconnection and all the other things that go into this, hopefully sooner than later we'll see more. I don't see any hands. I don't know if there's other questions.
We actually have 6 questions on the app.
Okay, great.
Should I just read the
Yeah,
top?
go for it.
All right, so the first one is, we kind of answered this, but I'll pose it anyway. The reliability of DC chargers has become a huge problem for many DC and many EV owners, and the large-scale charger failures during the deep freeze around Christmas gave a big validation to the EV deniers. As Wisconsin installs more DC chargers under this program, how would it hold the ChargePoint operators accountable to maintain the reliability?
Sure, I'm happy to start. I assume they mean the point of charge, not just only ChargePoint. But I'll take it for us. So I think reliability is a really critical question. Deb said it. Of course, no one wants to just put these stations up and then walk away. That kind of defeats the purpose of all this effort, and that why we're here. Reliability for at least the charging industry is a huge priority. If you pulled up to a station and it is not operable, we don't make a profit. So we are very interested in having reliable charging stations across the country. The other part about reliability is this is a new industry. We're still trying to understand why stations become inoperable, or that downtime, what's happening, why is a site not connected. So that question about extreme weather events, I think it's really nuanced to understand what happened during the extreme weather events. I know anecdotally that in the hurricanes that happened on the west coast of Florida, I can't remember what month, October, I think, stations remained operable. So why did they remain operable during a hurricane versus in a cold freeze? And I can say for ChargePoint, I was just at our headquarters. We have advanced testing labs that test in temperatures up to negative 40 degrees. So I don't think most of Wisconsin, maybe the upper Wisconsin, gets that cold. But we're testing, and not just us, ChargePoint. The industry is trying to make these as reliable as we can. And I think the next generation of chargers is going to integrate all this data we're collecting as an industry with our partners like the utilities to make the best effort to keep these online as much as possible, because like I said, no one wants them to be offline. So I see lots of hands now. Oh man. I don't know who has the mic. Oh, you have the mic.
Yeah, I have the mic. How should we handle app versus in person? Well,
I'd say in person. They came, they get priority. I can respond on the app also to the others.
Hi, my name is Emma Hines. I'm with the Electrification Coalition. Kind of building off of that question, and you can speak from ChargePoint and Xcel, or just kind of the industry as a whole. How are you prioritizing workforce development to be able to maintain these chargers? Like you were saying, these are going to take folks to repair them when they go down. How is that being included in long-term planning?
Yeah, I'm happy to start. I think workforce development is a huge question. We need a clean energy workforce in this country for every part of the clean energy workforce, not only in the charging world, but solar, et cetera. So workforce is a really important piece. I think understanding the different demands of building charging sites. So you're going to have our utility partners who have really mastered their workforce, and they are highly trained, and that is one piece. And you're going to have those who are authorized and certified to install charging stations, so that energization piece, so working with the utilities, that interconnection question. And you're going to have normal operation and maintenance. That might be if a screen goes down, and that's a cloud issue or a general technology issue, you probably don't need a certified electrician to fix a screen. If you know toddlers today, they can fix screens. So that belittles it. But my point is, I think understanding that we should build a workforce that's really diverse, not only from where the populations they come from, but for the skill sets. So we can really hire into every level of this transition and build it out robustly. Because I think if you can attract different skills, not only meaning skilled or unskilled labor, you can really build more efficiently. So and bring those programs to the universities, community colleges that are starting to teach to this clean energy transition. So I know from our perspective, we say it's very tiered. There's different jobs that need to be done, and that's how you maximize. I don't know, Deb, if you want to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of different things that need to be addressed potentially with operating and maintaining charging stations, right? And I think, the potential for software issues to be an issue when you arrive at a charger, I think is pretty big, actually. So, it's one of those that for certain things, you need people on the ground nearby, able to quickly, physically go to a charger. For other things, maybe you can fix remotely, or maybe you can't diagnose them until you go to the charger, right? And I think, especially when this network of charging stations is relatively new and relatively sparse, each one of those charging stations is really important to keep online, right? So I think that's just, it's interesting sort of to juxtapose with the early stage of the market development, in that it's almost like even more important in this very early stage for those chargers to be operational. And I guess the other thing I'll say is, one option and one of the ways that the industry, I think, has thought about addressing some of this is through redundancy, right? So if you think about a gas station, it typically doesn't have a single gas pump, right? So some level of redundancy at any particular charging location is one way to address, the potential for any of those charging ports to be unavailable.
I think in the back, yeah.
Hi, I'm Jacqueline with Focus on Energy, but I'm putting on my homeowner hat. I do have an EV. My question piggybacks off of reliability and hits on the point of consistency and expectations for EV owners. Just a little story. We were going to charge our EV, and we were looking at about probably like a 15-minute charge at a public station to get us to where we wanted to be. We get to the station, and turns out the output was significantly less than what we needed it to be. So instead of having a 15-minute charge time to get where we needed, it was actually going to be 30 minutes. So when we're talking about paying per minute, instead of paying 15 minutes, I had to pay for 30 minutes. And so my question is, probably for the DOT folks and ChargePoint, just how do we get building consistency so that, EV owners are not dealing with that kind of wait time and surprise on cost, right?
Absolutely. This is where that method of sale conversation comes back into question. And this is where the NEVI program is going to require, based on that preliminary rule, a sale by the kilowatt hour. So you'll no longer have to worry about charging by time and having some of those hidden costs. You'll have a more transparent, here's the cost of the kilowatt per hour, and those other capital costs that you'll be able to see on that charger. So you'll have a much more transparent understanding of what you're going to be paying for.
I think Kaleb covered it. I would just add, in terms of that, that knowing what output you're getting, it will be priced in, of course. If you're paying by the kilowatt hour, you know exactly what energy you've received for that price. It also, it becomes a question of the draw on the system. So like Deb has discussed, understanding the capacity constraints, especially, I don't know from your anecdote if there were 3 other vehicles also charging at the same time, and that does affect the draw power, especially, if you're being priced by the minute, you're going to feel it. So, those are the questions we're hoping we can put to bed this session in Wisconsin and hopefully make that more convenient, not only for you as an EV driver, but for all EV drivers on the road. I think we can take one last question, or no?
Just to piggyback
Yes.
on Kaleb, your comments. When is the timing expected to have the ability to charge by the kilowatt hour for charging?
So it's a conversation currently during this legislative session. So we're hoping that it's a this year answer to that question.
I need to wrap up now, but I want to thank our panelists for all their comments today, and for those being in the room. I think we all agree this is a really important topic, and thanks for being a part of this transition. If you have questions for the panelists or for me, you can find us through the app, or you can just come talk to us in person right now. Thank you all.